All right, everyone. Hello, and welcome to the current webinar series. It is 2 o'clock Central Time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone who is joining us today. We have a great presentation lined up with 3 different speakers from across the region. And today we're going to be talking about a topic that has been on a lot of our minds, planning and preparing for continued drought. We have areas within our region, in the North Central region. All of our states are facing some drought at in some areas, and we have areas that are in D3 and D4 conditions. I know we're all thinking about that as we look to spring, as we look to planting season. So we're going to be talking about how we plan and prepare for drought. The current webinar series is hosted by the North Central Region Water Network. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we are a 12-state extension-led network that is working to ensure safe and sufficient water supplies across the North Central region of the United States. We have representatives from Extension from all the 1862 land grants within the North Central region. And every month we do this current webinar series. We frame it as a speed networking series. So we'll be featuring 3 presentations around drought and giving you just a glimpse, just a speed update on what they're doing, their research, their portfolio and outreach, and allow you get to know their work and learn about it and get you information that you can follow up on. A little bit of information for you. We will have a Q&A panel, Q&A portion of the webinar today after all 3 of our presenters. So please put your questions for the presenters in the Q&A panel. You can find that at the bottom of your screen. We will take those questions that are most popular first. So if you see questions that you also find interesting, make sure to upvote those. We'll take those questions that are upvoted and try to get as many as we can within the hour. If you're experiencing any technical issues, or if you are wanting to introduce yourself, wanting to share any resources with your colleagues, feel free to do that. We have a chat feature for that on the side of your screen, so feel free to use that for any type of technical questions or for links for introducing yourselves. Use the Q&A panel for the questions for the presenters for that Q&A portion. Also, if you're having any issues calling in, you can't, or excuse me, using your internet for audio, you can call in if you need. You can just click the up arrow on the mute icon and then click switch to phone audio. If anyone is having issues with that, feel free to let us know. All right, let's dive in. So here are our presenters for today. We're excited to have 3 great presenters for you. Tanya Hai out of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and the National Drought Mitigation Center. Jason Otkin out of the Cooperative Institute for Meteorological Satellite Studies, Space Science and Engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And Adnan Ali, who is the North Dakota State climatologist and from North Dakota State University. So we'll talk a little bit about their research, their outreach, as well as some of their programming. First up is Tanya. Tanya is a research assistant professor and social science coordinator at the National Drought Mitigation Center and the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. We've had the privilege of working with Tanya a number of times over the years. And Tanya is going to be talking a little bit about some of her social science research into how drought planning occurs at the local, community, and basin-wide levels. So with that, Tanya, I will hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Anne. All right, give me a second to go through the ritual that we all do. I'll share my screen. All right, are we good? Can we see that? Oops, I'll get it going on slideshow.
Looks great.
Okay, super. And I will go ahead and start my video. Would you let me know if the voice starts cutting out, and I'd be happy to just turn the video off so that doesn't happen. I want to thank everybody for being here today and for inviting me to be part of this conversation. So I guess I'm kicking off the speed networking session. I want to talk about planning for drought with a quick overview of drought planning research at the National Drought Mitigation Center. Oh dear, why aren't we advancing? There we go. Okay. So if you're unfamiliar with the National Drought Mitigation Center, we are the academic home of the U.S. Drought Monitor, but monitoring is really only part of our mission. Our mission is to help people, organizations, and institutions build resilience to drought through both monitoring and planning and management. So I'm going to be talking about planning, the planning part of things. And the NDMC has a planning coordination area. It's headed by Cody Knutson. And we work with all levels of drought planning, from the individual farmer ranch to communities, clear up to the state and even national plans. Drought plans in general can focus on appropriate and timely drought response. Or plans can focus on mitigation before drought occurs in the form of water supply or demand management, or building ecological resilience. Plans can focus on both, ideally. So for this presentation, I'm really going to be focused on who has drought plans, what they look like, and what drives having a drought plan. I'm going to highlight a couple of recent social science research projects that we've done at the NDMC related to these questions. Our studies have really focused on everything from the individual community level, and a new study at the larger land management unit level. So I'm going to start talking about the individual level of drought planning. Some of you have probably already heard me talk about this research related to agricultural drought planning in the past. The NDMC has been working with ranchers since going back to like 2008, 2009 to develop and implement the Managing Drought Risk on the Ranch planning resources. And the URL is on the slide here. And after developing these tools, we have tried to pursue opportunities using surveys, focus groups, and other methods to really try to learn who and what types of operations have drought plans, how they're using them, what they look like, what effect they've had. And so today I'm really just going to talk about, at the agricultural level, who has drought plans. So to date, it seems like drought planning is most common with range-based livestock producers, more so than like row crop growers. But some of our work with perennial specialty crop growers has pointed to opportunities for exploring drought planning with that group as well. So I think there's opportunities for working with other groups of producers. And among ranchers themselves, there seems to be some differences in who has drought plans. So in a 2017 study in the Northern Plains that I was able to do actually with Jason Otkin, the target area you can see in the map in the upper right. We found that about 60% of the ranchers who responded to our survey said that they had some type of plan for drought. And those plans probably really vary in how detailed they are and what they encounter. But we found some differences. So we found that larger operations in terms of acreage and sales were more likely to have plans. We found that operations that had access to irrigation were less likely. So kind of a combination of having a need for a plan and having the ability to implement plans. And then, like I said, there's really a range of what people consider to be drought plans. For ranchers, they usually are focused on grazing, stocking rate decisions during drought. Some ranchers have much more holistic drought plans that are integral to their overall range health and restoration goals. So kind of just a range in how people are doing things and who has them at the individual level. And I just wanted to touch on that, but then I wanted to move on from the individual level to talk about some more recent work that we've been able to do exploring how local community planners are thinking about drought planning. So I want to talk about a survey that we were able to undertake with the American Planning Association. And we did that in 2018. And we used this survey of community planners to understand how drought is being incorporated into a range of local plans across the country and what barriers that planners see as limiting their drought planning efforts. So we have a couple slides about that. So In the upper right-hand corner map, you can see a map that shows the general locations of the communities represented in the survey. So we got good coverage across the whole country, but some pockets obviously with more coverage than others. So when we think about local communities, really, they tend to be awash in different types of plans. There's land use plans and comprehensive plans, hazard mitigation plans that might be required, water supplier plans, economic development plans. And we were interested in where does drought get addressed in all of this. And what we found through this survey was that currently drought seems to be addressed most commonly just in all these communities across the country in local community water and hazard mitigation plans. And we also found that most of the survey respondents thought that these two types of plans were actually the most effective places, the most effective ways to address drought impacts locally. So we thought that was interesting. On average, community planners seemed less interested in developing standalone drought plans like you might find at the state level. We did find that having a standalone drought plan was more likely in communities that had experienced more drought over the past 10 years. And the map on the lower left, you can see the total weeks in severe drought over a 10-year period. And we found it was more likely to have a standalone plan if in a community that had a larger population that required reliable water supplies. So clearly concern about drought risk is driving having a more specific standalone drought plan rather than incorporating into other plans, maybe driving whether it's worth investing in that standalone drought planning process. So we wanted to learn a little bit more about what type of resources seem to be needed for drought planning, what limits drought planning in communities. And one of the things that we found right off the bat that we thought was interesting was that most of the local planners that took our survey, 80%, had no prior experience with drought planning. And so it seems like potentially just that lack of experience at the local level may be a important missing source of capacity right now. In addition, we asked planners how much of a barrier they thought different resources were to their drought planning efforts. And you can see that they pointed to funding, leadership, and coordination across different planning jurisdictions as the biggest barriers that they saw to addressing drought through planning. So we wanted to explore that a little bit more. We did some additional analysis, and in going back to planner experience, we actually found that planners who did have experience with drought planning, they tended to see that list of potential barriers, they saw that as less of a limit to addressing drought through planning. So if they had experience, they felt like maybe it was more overcomable. Similarly, we found that local planners who were communicating more frequently with water and hazard planners also tended to report barriers as being less serious hindrances or limits. And we found that planners that were in states with state drought mitigation plans, so state level plans, that they tended to perceive fewer or less barriers to drought planning. So those seem to point to a couple of maybe important types of capacity that we could focus on building to really help and support efforts to manage drought through planning at the local level. And then finally, I want to quickly highlight some work focused on ecological drought planning and management. And this tends to take place more at the basin level or other land management units, like maybe a forest management unit, somewhere between communities or state, or it might even overlap state lines. So we at the NDMC and others have started to do the work to understand how drought is addressed in these watershed scale and other drought plans like this. The map that I've pulled up and highlighted here is from a study of watershed plans in southwestern Montana. We worked on this study with a really great team that you can maybe see in the citation down on the lower right, that included Jamie McAvoy at Montana State University. And I mentioned Jamie because we're actually just launching a new research project with Jamie and with Jason Otkin to better understand how ecological land managers are considering drought in their decision-making and plans, and seeing if there are maybe some different unique needs. This project is actually also based in Montana. So Jamie is at Montana State University, and we're working with Sarah Church at Montana State University. They're co-leading the social science work. We will be engaging with land managers through a combination of interviews, survey, focus groups, to really understand what monitoring they're doing, how new tools can support their planning efforts, how drought factors into their planning efforts at that level as well. So maybe we'll be able to come back and share what we learned in a couple of years. So I'm actually going to wrap up there. I tried to keep it short and simple. I appreciate being part of the conversation. Hopefully something of interest and something that leads into the rest of the discussion with Jason and Adnan. So of course, always feel free to follow up with me directly at the email. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat so I can see if I can answer them. Thanks, Anne.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Tanya.
I will stop sharing. There we go.
All right. Well, that will flow nicely into our second presentation here from Jason Otkin. As you can see, Jason is a research scientist at the Space Science and Engineering Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a frequent collaborator with Tanya. Jason is one of the leading experts in flash droughts. So really interested to hear a little bit about his work in terms of monitoring and assessment and early warning for flash droughts. So with that, I won't read his full bio. I'll let folks skim that over, but I will stop sharing and hand it over to Jason.
All right. Thank you for the introduction. I see I'm actually wearing the same shirt I had in my bio photo. So, so thank you for the introduction. In this presentation, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about an essay that we recently wrote for the Bulletin of the American Ecological Society that aims to improve our ability to monitor, predict, plan for, and respond to flash drought events. So drought is a naturally recurrent feature of the climate system that refers to a water deficit occurring over some period of time. Because these water deficits can impact the environment in different ways, several different types of drought have been recognized by the drought community. Traditionally, these have included meteorological, agricultural, hydrological, and socioeconomic drought. But in recent years, several new types of drought have also been recognized. These include ecological drought, which refers to the impacts of water stress on the health and functioning of natural ecosystems. Snow drought, which is below normal snowpack or snow water equivalent. And then finally, flash drought, which are droughts that develop very quickly over a few weeks to a couple of months. So because flash drought is a relatively new concept, many people have asked me, what are flash droughts and why are they important? So the simple answer is that flash droughts are a subset of all types of droughts, or all drought events that are primarily characterized by a period of rapid intensification. So, as we've seen several times across the Midwest during the last decade, droughts can develop very quickly when you have extreme weather anomalies that persist for at least a few weeks. Flash droughts tend to occur most often during the growing season, and because of this, they can have very large impacts on vegetation. For example, they can lead to a very rapid browning and perhaps even death of those plants. And that's what I'm showing on the figure on the left, where the top two panels are showing how the native grassland vegetation across northern Oklahoma had rapidly turned brown and most likely gone into dormancy over a 5-week period during the 2012 flash drought. And that stands in sharp contrast to the continued greenness of that grassland during the same time period during a wetter year in 2014. So among their various impacts, flash droughts can lead to lower crop yields. They can also lead to less forage production for livestock and to larger and more intense wildfires. Okay, so because flash droughts can have a very large impact on various parts of the environment and also the economy, it's really important that we develop robust early warning systems for flash drought. So in our essay, we described 5 interrelated topics that together constitute the pillars that are necessary to develop a robust flash drought early warning system. So these include the development of a physically based identification framework, a comprehensive flash drought monitoring capability, and then also the ability to have improved prediction of flash drought over various timescales. These 3 pillars then will lead into improved assessments of the impacts of flash drought and also provide better guidance for decision-making and policy activities. So I'm going to discuss each of these 5 pillars during the rest of this presentation. But first I want to highlight the text at the bottom of the slide, where I'm emphasizing that in order to develop a truly robust early warning system, it really does take the sustained engagement between many groups of people. So this includes physical scientists, social scientists, the people that are making the forecasts at the operational centers, and then I'm also practitioners and policymakers. Okay, so the first pillar of the early warning system then is to have a good identification framework that you can use to identify when flash droughts are occurring. In some of our previous work, we argued that any definition for flash drought has to account for the rapid rate of intensification and also for the actual occurrence of moisture limitations that leads to impacts at the land surface. So the important thing here is that this period of rapid intensification can occur either at drought onset or it can occur during an ongoing drought. So we argue in our essay that both types should be considered flash drought because in both cases they do lead to new or to worsening drought conditions. So these 2 examples are shown in panels A and B, where panel A shows flash drought that develops from a drought-free initial state, and then panel B is when flash drought occurs during an ongoing drought. And you can see that in both situations, they have that period of rapid intensification in the yellow shaded, and that stands very different to what happens during the conventional drought on the right, where you just kind of slowly fall into drought conditions. Okay, so flash droughts are more likely to develop whenever you have multiple weather extremes that occur at the same time, and then also last for several weeks. So this can include some combination of below normal rainfall, hot temperatures, low humidity, strong winds, and sunny skies. And the more of these you can get working in tandem with each other, the more likely you're going to have a more severe flash drought event. So flash droughts are usually identified based on rapid changes in variables that are sensitive to the land surface. So this will include things like evaporative demand, soil moisture, evapotranspiration, or vegetation health. Ideally, tools that are used to monitor flash drought should account for all of these environmental variables, and they should do that from the onset of the flash drought until it ultimately falls back into normal conditions. Now, because of the multivariate nature of flash drought, it really does take multiple lines of evidence in order to generate a measure of, is flash drought occurring and how intense is it? So the more variables are showing that conditions are rapidly deteriorating, the more confidence you can have that flash drought is occurring and that it is severe. The last thing on this slide is that I'll point out that many of the existing operational monitoring tools may not be sufficiently responsive to detect flash drought, and that's because they were primarily designed to detect slower developing droughts. Okay, so thus far, accurate and reliable predictions of flash drought have proven to be elusive. That's because efforts to predict them is still very much in their infancy. For example, there was very little warning, basically no warning, that the very destructive flash droughts were going to occur in 2012 across the Midwest or the Northern Plains in 2017. One of the main reasons why the forecast are still pretty inaccurate is because there are large knowledge gaps remaining regarding how the various drivers, both locally and remote, within the Earth system cause flash droughts to develop. So this incomplete understanding of the physical drivers of flash drought means that it's then difficult to actually perform like process level evaluations of the Earth system models that are used to predict flash drought. And that then also means it's difficult to identify ways to improve those models. So what that points to then is that there is a need to perform new research to improve the parameterizations that are used within the dynamical models, and also the methods that are used within the statistical models to predict flash droughts. We also recommended in our essay that any flash drought outlook should ideally be a probabilistic, issued at least weekly, if not at higher frequency. And then I'm also aligned with sector-specific flash drought impacts. And these things are all necessary in order to provide the most information for end users. Okay, then on flash drought impacts, they tend to depend upon the timing of the rapid intensification, and also by how long the drought conditions last, and of course how severe they are. A very important thing with flash droughts is that they can increase how long an area stays in drought, and also the probability that extreme drought conditions will develop. The reason for this is simply that the more quickly you fall into drought, the more likely you're going to stay there, and also the higher chance it's just going to become severe. So with flash droughts, their impacts can develop very quickly, and they can develop more quickly than what can be effectively managed. So this is not like a conventional drought where you might have several months to prepare for its onset. Flash droughts can develop in just a few weeks. So it takes a different kind of management in order to prepare for them and also to respond to their impacts. So the focus of most studies has been on the agricultural sector, when looking at their impacts. So it's also important that we do other studies that look at the ecological and hydrological impacts of flash drought. We also need to better understand how the impacts of flash drought can vary by region or season, because that's very important when developing these early warning systems. And then at the bottom of the slide, I'm pointing out that the ability to assess the impacts, not just of flash drought, but of all droughts, relies upon the continuous monitoring and collection of drought impacts. So I'm talking about more than just observations and model reanalyses, but also looking at on the ground reports by people in the field. Because pictures from people are so valuable when it comes to trying to verify how well different monitoring tools are doing at depicting flash drought. Okay, then finally, the fifth pillar then of the early warning system is decision-making and policy. So in this slide, I'm showing an example that shows the collaboration and communication channels that exist within the NIDIS Midwest Drought Early Warning System. So what this rather complicated figure shows is it emphasizes all of the different subsystems of cooperation and communication that must increase during flash drought in order to try to mitigate its impacts. So policy and planning responses are generally more useful when they can be informed by knowledge obtained by people that are actually part of that network. And what flash drought does is it emphasizes the need for all of these channels of communication to be functioning ahead of time. The reason for this is that, when you have a very short time scale or rapid intensification, you have to have very efficient coordination. You have to have very efficient flow of information in order to anticipate and reduce those negative impacts. So this is not something that you can spin up while flash droughts are happening. It's definitely something that needs to be in place before flash droughts actually occur. So with that, I'll stop here. Be happy to take any questions once we get to the question and answering session. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Jason. All right. As a reminder, Jason, would you mind stop sharing your screen here? Thank you so much. All right. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Adnan Ali. As a reminder to folks, please put your questions for our speakers in the Q&A panel. We will have time for Q&A on both all three presentations, Adnan's presentation here. Adnan is the North Dakota State climatologist. He's also a professor for climatological practice at North Dakota State University and oversees the North Dakota State Climate Office. So I'm excited Adnan could join us today to talk a little bit about how he's putting that monitoring and assessment to practice in North Dakota, certainly as they're facing some drought this year, along with much of the other regions. All right, Adnan, take it away.
Okay, let me share my screen with you while I am uploading it here. F5 would start from the beginning. Come on, you can do this. Yes. And if I wanted to add something to the previous speaker, and flash drought those 2017 in the Northern Plains, standalone in North Dakota, was $1 to $2 billion weather event based on the NCEI $1 billion the weather events. And yes, it could be costly. And you see this by looking at the drought monitor map that publishes, I'm sorry, every Thursday, 8 in the morning. And I wanted to bring you a different perspective from my perspective and people like me, the providing feedback to drought monitor. And I assume that the crowd knows just a little bit about the drought monitor process in terms of the drought monitor author. Authorship changes between the NOAA, the National Drought Mitigation Center, and USDA. And the current drought monitor author is from the NCEI, and in fact, it is his first week actually on board. And you can imagine the toughness of the job. One person sitting in his office or her office sometimes, and trying to come up with the drought monitor map for the entire nation. So that person utilizes or take advantage of local expertise. And I am going to talk about my activities as the person who provides feedback to the drought monitor author in my state. What I do usually is I myself tap into 53 counties in North Dakota and try to get feedback from 53 county agents from the NDSU or North Dakota State University Extension Services. And they provide feedback. They have a deadline, Monday noon, and it would give me time to process the data. And every Tuesday by noon, that is my deadline to provide feedback to the author of the week. So what I do is that I go through this process to come up with the map. Map on the left-hand side is probably on the left-hand side is the previous drought monitor map. This is 2 weeks ago, and I am not showing you this week's on purpose because the drought monitor hasn't been published yet, and we are not supposed to discuss the drought monitor map with the public before it is published. So I am giving you the 2 weeks ago, and this is the 3 weeks ago's map, and you see this a little line indicating that maybe the D2 portion on the East Central North Dakota should be moved to D1. And based on the facts that you will see in the progressing slides, for example, on the upper right-hand corner, I make it easy for me to see during the 7 days of precipitation. This is in North Dakota, usually snowfall. And the map on the lower right corner is the temperature departure from normal. So I am looking at the most North Dakota did not get precipitation except for southeastern portions, and it was colder than normal except for the west central portions of the state. And some people may consider that the drought is a creeping disaster, so therefore I should be looking at the much longer term precipitation and temperature data. And I would say, yes, you're right. But when we are doing this every week, sometimes it is easier to look at the change since last time. And I also look at the longer term precipitation deficit or excess on the left-hand side, upper left on the 30-day periods. You see this above normal precipitation on the eastern and below normal precipitation on the western side of the state. And during the last 60-day period on the upper right-hand corner, at the same time, we realized that most of that precipitation came in terms of snowfall during the first 15 days in December. And in fact, the second half of December did not precipitate at all in any place in North Dakota. And it precipitated, snowfall was so much in the first 15-day period, it made the entire month of December the wettest December on record for North Dakota. So knowing that gives the local experts perspective that maybe we shouldn't be looking at the above normal precipitation. And in fact, it is between 400 to 600%. In other words, 4 times to 6 times as much precipitation as it would fall during the last 60-day period. And you also have to keep in mind that the precipitation amount is very small in North Dakota. So any amount of precipitation that is above normal is going to exaggerate that kind of concept. So not only the short term, but we look at the long term deficit or excess before we make any recommendation. We also look at the snow depth, for example, on the left-hand side to see what would be the melting situation is going to create. Not only we are looking at the drought and perhaps our focus shifts into a flood, what would be the potential for the flood, especially in the eastern North Dakota, where the Red River flows to the north, which makes it very vulnerable to seasonal floods. We are looking at, for example, on the western North Dakota is having maybe a less snowfall sitting on the ground. That might be maybe alarming. And even looking at the water equivalent on the right-hand side, still the western North Dakota is sitting in much less liquid equivalents. When it melts, it would trickle into the soil, and that it would probably either ease the soil moisture deficit that we came into the season in the fall, or it would eliminate that soil moisture deficit. So we are looking at that, for example. For example, on the previous map, you notice that the southwestern or western North Dakota started getting dry. Should we worry about that? On the map on the left-hand side is indicating maybe not much snow. Maybe I should trigger this week about adding more drought conditions in the western North Dakota. Then I also look at the DOT road, the cameras. March on the left-hand side, for example, that's the southwest North Dakota. I am looking at, actually, I downloaded this picture yesterday in real time, looking at pretty good snow, actually. On the right-hand side, beach, North Dakota, this is western North Dakota. Those are the two areas that I was really concerned. So it is not uncommon for me to utilize some unconventional resources. I am sure most of you are familiar with the sports. This is the NASA Sports Soil Moisture Ranking Percentile on the left-hand side. It is the surface. It surprised me that that snowfalls trickle down into the snow, the soil, I should rather say, and that made the soil and even become above normal in the southwestern North Dakota. And I look at the soil temperatures, and in that area is just about freezing to above freezing temperatures because it is insulated under the snow. And you have to keep in mind it had been very warm, much warmer than normal during up until maybe a week ago, and we recently started getting cold. Map on the right-hand side is the root zone down to 100 centimeters in the soil profile. It looks like that snow melt only impacted the top portions of the soil, but the bottom portions of the soil is not replenished yet. So we consider that too. We also look at the CMOR reports. CMOR stands for Condition Monitoring Observer Reports, and Tanya kind of talked about it in her presentation earlier. We don't get much CMOR reports in the wintertime, since especially when a lot of snow is sitting on the ground. It becomes less important for the local experts in each county. So I downloaded this from April 5th of 2022, just to give you an example of what kind of reports that I would utilize in the Seymour. The Williams County, for example, that is the northwestern portions of the state. The picture on the right-hand side is from the Williston, which is in the Williams County, and you're looking at the dust storm. This is spring, and we are still supposed to have snow there. But the wind was so fierce that it drifted some of that snow elsewhere and still kept some of that soil exposed and to drifting as well. So the county agent is verifying that the western portions of the state is extremely dry, and talking about the picture, how dust is blowing off the fields, causing poor visibility, but at the same time talking about a good phenomena that we should be watching. Some of these fields still had crop residue, but it was so dry that even those fields were blowing dust. Typically, these areas are not dry since it is irrigated, but this year there hasn't been enough snow cover or moisture to hold the soil. So that is really important information. Otherwise, I would have no idea of the region by just sitting in my office and trying to estimate the conditions based on the meteorological data. Another couple reports, and again, these are April 5th, 2022. The Ward County is also talking about snow drift, and the Pierce County is indicating, comparing the western Pierce County with the eastern Pierce County, and also it is indicating it is normal. That information, even though it is normal, is extremely important for me and extremely important for the drought monitor author to know that there is no problem in certain counties. And in the end, I saved the sketch, and I discussed this with my partners in South Dakota, North Dakota is me, in Minnesota, Montana, and my couple, the partners in the National Weather Service and Bismarck office and Grand Forks office to see if this makes sense, and the borders doesn't need to be adjusted, and if all says okay, and that map goes to the drought monitor author as the recommendation from North Dakota. We also look at the forecast. This particular one, for example, next 7 days of snow forecast, it is not much. We also look at the 7-day precipitation anomaly on the left-hand side, and the temperature, since this is 2 weeks ago, it is much above normal, but we are getting into much cooler than normal temperatures. And then what happens in every other Thursday, we meaning the North Egg Disaster Response Team, they get together in wintertime, in the summertime as well. We discuss the conditions during this meeting. Some of the people in this the meeting, the team is myself as a state climatologist. I briefed the group on the drought status and talk about the outlook. And I of course I present much longer presentation for this meeting. And the SC extension, each counties are represented by the county agents. They do their reports. FSA, North Dakota State Water Resources, Department of Agriculture, North Dakota Department of Emergency the Services, and some of these presentations would be in the form of available state and federal fundings that is made available for the farmers to mitigate the impact, and disaster declaration activities by the emergency services, and also Forest Service, Governor's Office, and delegations of the Congress are at this meeting. That is the end of my presentation. Let me stop sharing so I could pass the microphone back to AnneMarie.
Great. Thank you so much, Adnan. We appreciate that. Please take a second and put your questions for our presenters in the Q&A panel, as we will have time here now to ask some questions to folks on their presentations. Tanya, Adnan, and Jason, thank you so much for your time. I know this is top of mind for a lot of folks in our region and a lot of folks that are working with producers. While we're waiting for some,
While we're waiting, I just want to say, I just found out one of my co-authors is on the call. So I want to say Elliot Wickham, who's down in South Carolina now, was instrumental to the planning studies at the local level and the basin level. So, haha, Elliot, called you out.
He says, thanks.
So he can answer my questions.
You're all to Elliot there. Yeah, I'm curious, while we're waiting for a question, I have a question just to start us off here. Adnan, I'm curious to hear from you about the coordination and effort that goes into coordinating with all the extension county agents in terms of your reporting. I mean, it really looked like you were explaining an example of that communication system that, you know, Jason, your dues graphic kind of illustrated that you need in place prior to drought occurring in order to utilize that. How did that come to be? Is that common in all states? Or how do you go about facilitating getting that input from all county educators?
I think it is common. It may not be as strong as mine. I feel lucky that I am located with the College of Agriculture, and the director of the extension services just across my office in the same hallway. And we can communicate and we can convince each other that this partnership really is for the state. It helps. And I had meetings maybe a couple years ago with the other states when they start seeing a lot of input coming in Seymour. And in fact, almost maybe 90% of the input coming in the United States were coming from North Dakota. And it made people realize that there must be something going on with North Dakota. And I had interview with the states they wanted to be on board. And we talked about what North Dakota did. And I think that was helpful. Now North Dakota is not 90% anymore. And in fact, most other states, they are contributing more than North Dakota, which is great news. And which tells me that the other states are doing something similar to what North Dakota does. And thanks to Seymour, it makes our jobs much easier.
Absolutely. Yeah, great. Thank you. I know that is something that takes a lot of time to facilitate and to pull together. And obviously it's always helpful when we have extension to help as that kind of bridge, but certainly bringing together all those other partners that you mentioned on the team. We do have a question from someone here noting, you know, on the U.S. drought monitor map currently, what is the importance of the delamates, dominant impact lines, and also why is SL together sometimes and L and S alone sometimes? I'm curious if folks have that answer. I don't have the current drought monitor map up, but maybe that's helpful in terms of interpreting those maps.
Tanya, you want to take it as a National Drought Mitigation Center, or do you want me to answer?
No, as a social scientist, I would much prefer you answer that question.
Okay, well, SL stands for the short and the long term. Sometimes the drought monitor author looks at the short-term indicators and change the map, do the designation either D0, D1, D4, 4 level of the D levels. That would be the short term, and the long term. Some of these long term indicators are starting from 6 months to 9 months, and perhaps the drought monitor designation changes based on these indication, and then the drought monitor author pulled the L sign indicating the long term. And some of these lines are, I think we mentioned that D0 indicating abnormally dry conditions, and D1 is indicating moderate drought, and all the way to D4 being exceptional drought.
Yeah, and I think to build off of what Adnan is saying is that you have situations where the indicators may be disagreeing with each other, where you might be you might have been in a long-term drought, but you're in a short-term wet spell. So on the drought monitor, they can only indicate one drought severity. Which one do they show then? You're fine on the short term, but you still dry in the long term. So in that situation, they would choose a drought category and then put the L label on it, indicating that this region is a long-term drought. And then likewise with the S label, Perhaps over the last year, they've been quite wet. The last 2 months have been really dry. So again, you have a disagreement in the drought indicators. In that situation, they would indicate that the drought severity on the map is consistent with the short-term drought.
Great, thank you. I think that's really helpful in interpreting these maps.
And also, I just added the link since Adnan mentioned Seymour a few times and how useful that is. I just wanted to put the link for that in the chat. It's a tool that if you're not familiar with it, anybody can use it. Anybody can use it to submit a report of the conditions that they're seeing locally in their backyard, in their farm, in their parks, pretty much anywhere. And it's very easy to use.
Yeah, thank you for that, Tanya. I'm not always talking about, Seymour County, for example.
Yeah, yep, it's CMOR, yeah.
Claudia has a question for Adnan. Are you seeing any evidence of regenerative practices on moisture retention?
Natural practices, definitely, based on the map that sports model at the surface we saw. And again, it is surprising to me that this time of the year, generally, the ground is frozen and the snow sitting on the ground does not trickle into the soil. And this time it did. Even though we have so much snow on the soil, and I think some of the locations are switching the mood from droughts into flood, especially in the eastern North Dakota. Usually it takes about springtime to realize what the potential is, and then the snow melts and the ground thaws a little later, and some of that would overflow into the nearest ditches to fill the rivers and the sloughs and the water holes, and also after that the thaw process take place, and then it would trickle into the soil to regenerate that the moisture that was lacking during the last fall. This is the natural process, and I am not aware of any other unnatural or man-made or mitigation efforts to practice the moisture retention.
Gotcha. I think Claudia is maybe referring to, regenerative agricultural practices, soil health practices, which I know has just been a focus a lot within the agricultural and the producer community. And, are we seeing that? Maybe folks are seeing that at the field scale, but maybe are you seeing that at all at the scale you're looking at for state and for monitoring in terms of, how producers are maybe taking on more regenerative soil health practices, and if that's impacting, soil moisture overall? I know that, a lot of times that's what folks are thinking of when they're doing, one of soil erosion, but other things to that as well. So I also know in extremely dry areas, covers don't always work because of that.
Yeah, there are two things that comes into my mind is the cover crop and the no-till, and those both of those practices are being observed in North Dakota. So I guess the answer to that question for me is yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah, that's helpful. I have a question for you, Tanya. I thought your research in terms of who's having drought plans was really interesting. If you have a state drought plan, you're more likely to. So it seems like maybe some top-down efforts can be made to have more state level plans. But you also noted that, if you work with, emergency management, if you're kind of out there and serving as a bridge, maybe as that local planner, you're more likely to have a plan as well. So that kind of like the grass level up in terms of what, planners can do is, just make connections with those folks. Is that kind of how you interpret it, or how would you go about saying, now we need to take this research that you're doing and saying, how would we put it to practice to make sure that more community level planners are thinking and preparing for drought?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. We asked that question, and actually it was really of interest to Elliot, so you can chime in. Because like I said, especially at that local community level, there tend to be a lot of different planning efforts that happen, and a lot of them happen in a pretty siloed way. So the economic development plan doesn't necessarily impact the hazard mitigation plan, for example. And so we were really interested in, but interestingly, you can address drought, you can mitigate drought impacts, you can respond to drought in a lot of ways that actually could be addressed by a lot of different types of plans. So we sort of went into this project thinking, you know, how could we raise awareness of how drought can be addressed in different plans, and what actually helps people build the capacity, the know-how, the experience, the resources to start thinking about how to implement drought in those ways, in drought planning in those ways. So yeah, when we specifically asked that question of, like, you know, you work in your own planning area, how much are you talking to hazard planners? How much are you talking to water planners in your work? And we're really interested to find that it did seem to make a big difference in how people, you know, felt it was, how possible people felt it was to actually incorporate drought into their plans. So so for us, that was, you know, that was kind of guidance, like going forward, make sure, like, part of our work can be supporting making that networking happen, and that can help improve drought resilience at the community level.
Great, thank you. I was curious too, you know, when you're thinking about, so who, you talked about local community planners for drought. Who is that often? You know, I think of it, is it someone who's working at the county? When I really think of it, I think of like SWCD staff, folks that are working at a county or municipality level.
Yeah.
If I'm thinking about that right. And I wondered too a little bit about how you go about it, because so many folks that do that kind of community development, community planning, they don't have planning in their job titles. Like,
that is true. And the audience that we worked with, so we may not have been capturing all those people even. The audience that we worked with were either members of or associated with the American Planning Association. So I would say 75% of the folks who responded to the survey were probably working in land use planning. So they were working in, you know, comprehensive land use, flood protection, you know, types of, or just what's the land going to be used for? I shouldn't even say flood protection kind of area. So they'd be in larger communities, they'd probably be working in their own planning and zoning department. In more rural communities, I think you're right, probably working more at a, you know, there's planning districts usually, or at the county level to do that kind of planning.
Wonderful, thank you. I know I always wonder about that from a social perspective. I know even in Wisconsin, we're a little different. We often have like departments of planning and zoning within our counties, and those folks can sometimes be also county conservationists.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden they find themselves like, oh, now this is my responsibility. So that's all things we need to think about when we're trying to work with that level of government to be more drought resilient, is whose lap does this fall into? What resources do they have to actually incorporate drought planning into their work, is all really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. With that, I know it's 2:58 according to my clock here. So thank you so much, Tanya, Adnan, and Jason, for taking time out of your day to share a little bit of your work with us. I know it's just a taste of what you're doing. We did want to provide your emails for folks if you had a question or sitting on something that thinks, oh, you know, come back around. Feel free to email them and get in touch with them to learn more about their work or to get your question answered. The North Central Regional Water Network will be having the current webinar series next month, February 8th, I believe is the date, Wednesday, February 8th. It's always on a Wednesday at 2 p.m. And we'll be looking at water quality and wetland mapping. But even before then, we actually have a webinar coming up from our algal bloom action team with Donna Hill from the EPA, talking about the toxins associated with freshwater harmful algal blooms and really their effects on their health effects on the mammalian population. So feel free to tune in for that as well. I will put a link to that Zoom link in the chat for folks. That is on Wednesday, February 1st at 11 a.m. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.